She was bleeding out in a blizzard, and the worst hadn't even started yet. Leslie had no idea that the frozen cabin she'd just broken into, claw marks on the door, wolves in the tree line, alpha scent so thick it pressed against her ribs like a fist, belonged to the one man every pack in the kingdom had declared dead, Trevor Ashcore, the exiled Alpha King, the man who made the entire High Pack Council strip his crown rather than face what he knew about them. And he was already walking through the snow toward his own front door. You think she's going to run? She can't. She's too broken, too frozen, too far gone. But here's what nobody saw coming. She's going to stay. And that one desperate, half-conscious decision? It's going to crack the entire Omega binding system wide open. Because Leslie isn't just a runaway Omega. She's the one gift the Council has been hunting for 7 years. And she just walked herself directly to the only Alpha alive who knows exactly what she's worth. Hit, like if you love wolf stories, subscribe, and drop your city below. Where in the world is this story finding you? Chapter 1. The door opened without sound. That was the first thing Leslie registered. Not the cold that poured in behind him, not the sheer mass of the silhouette filling the frame, not even the 2 wolves that pressed through on either side of him like gray water finding a crack. It was the silence of the hinges. A man who oiled his door in an abandoned territory was a man who expected to need quiet exits, or quiet entrances. She had backed herself against the far wall before her mind caught up with her legs. He was enormous. Not in the exaggerated way pack enforcers sometimes were, thick with borrowed aggression and too much ritual meat. This was structural. Long black hair hung loose past his shoulders, dark and snow-damp. His chest was bare despite the killing cold outside, carved with the kind of definition that came not from vanity, but from years of surviving without a pack at his back, leather riding trousers, iron-buckled boots, a wolf head clasp at his belt that Leslie recognized from somewhere she could not yet name, pressed beneath the fog of blood loss and exhaustion. His eyes found her immediately, dark, still, and deeply unimpressed. The wolves flanked him without a command, one moving left along the wall, one right, both silent, both watching her with the patient intelligence of animals that had been hunting longer than she had been alive. Leslie pressed harder against the stone. Her hand found the fire poker she'd set beside the hearth 2 hours ago, when the instinct for self-preservation was still louder than the pain. She raised it. The man looked at the poker, then at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite amusement and not quite contempt. Something in the narrow space between them. He stepped inside and closed the door. "You're bleeding on my floor," he said. His voice was low, not a growl, not a performance of dominance the way Beta Kale used to project his across the compound yard, just a fact, delivered flatly, as though blood on floorboards was an administrative problem requiring correction. Leslie said nothing. Her ribs were screaming. The gash Kale's claws had opened 3 days ago had re-torn somewhere in the last mile of snow, and the bandaging she'd improvised from her underskirt was soaked entirely through. She could feel the warmth of it against her side, which was alarming, because she had stopped feeling warmth in most other places an hour ago. "The fire's good," he said, moving toward the kitchen shelf without looking at her again, the wolves settling to the floor like they'd been asked. "You built it, right? Most people smother it trying to get warm fast." She did not lower the poker. He lifted an iron pot from the shelf, moved to the water barrel, filled it with the efficiency of a man who had performed the sequence 10,000 times alone, and set it over, the fire. Then he crouched and opened the low cabinet beside the hearth. She heard glass, cloth, the dry wooden rattle of a sealed tin. He set the items on the floor beside the fire and looked up at her. Full eye contact, steady and deliberate, the way dominant wolves did when they wanted you to understand the permission was calculated, not reflexive. "You can keep holding that," he said, nodding at the poker. "Or you can let me close that wound before you fall over, and I have to move you. Either way, sit down." Leslie's legs chose for her. She dropped onto the edge of the hearthstone, poker still in her fist, and in the orange stutter of firelight she finally saw his belt clasp clearly. The wolf head, silver, old, with a crown of frost iron worked above the skull. The ash-core sigil, she had seen it once in a torn broadsheet that had blown through the Grey Vale compound gates when she was newly collared. Before the betas started controlling what the Omegas could read, there had been a face beside the sigil. Younger then, clean-shaven, but the bones were the same. The room tilted. Trevor Ashcore, the Alpha King the High Pack Council had stripped and exiled 3 years ago. The one the elders called a destabilizer, an abomination, a traitor to Pack law. The one the younger Omegas whispered about in the healing ward at night, voices low and careful, calling him something else entirely. The man who had tried to end the binding rites. He was opening the tin of suture thread with his thumbnail, utterly unbothered by the fact that she was staring at him like he was something she had stepped on and could not identify. "You're Greyvale," he said, not a question. "But that's not all you are." He did not look up from the thread. "We'll leave the rest for when you're not bleeding out on my floor." Chapter 2. He worked without narration. That was the second thing Leslie cataloged about Trevor Ashcore. The first being the door, the silence of it. He did not fill space with reassurance. No soft commands, no explanations of what he was about to do before he did it. He simply knelt beside her on the hearthstone, moved the ruined hem of her underskirt aside with 2 fingers, and looked at the wound the way a builder looks at a crack in a load-bearing wall. Assessing, categorizing, deciding. She watched his face for disgust and found none, only the same flat attention he'd given the fire poker. "Hold this," he said, and pressed a folded cloth to her side. She took it, and he moved to the pot, adding a measure of something dark and sharp-smelling from a brown bottle. The wolves had not moved from the floor. The larger one, the one that had taken the left wall, had its head resting on its forepaws now, watching her with eyes that were almost amber in the firelight. Leslie had the unsettling impression it was more curious than hostile. Trevor returned, knelt again, and removed the cloth. He examined what was beneath it without expression. 3 days old, he said. 2.5. He glanced up briefly, as though confirming she was capable of speech. Then he reached for the suture thread. The pain was precise and total. Leslie had been stitched before, twice in the Greyvale healing ward, once by herself in the dark with a sewing needle and a leather strap to bite. And it never became something the body accepted gracefully. She kept her breathing even by focusing on the fire, on the amber eyes of the wolf, on the buckles of Trevor's boots, which were good leather, old and maintained, the kind of boots a man resoldered himself rather than replaced. He worked quickly, cleanly. He anchored each stitch with a surety that told her he had done this not to other people, but to himself. That specific, practiced confidence of a man who had sat alone in exactly this firelight, reaching awkwardly for his own injuries, teaching his hands to be steady because there was no one else. The thought arrived without her permission, and she dismissed it. When he tied off the final stitch, he pressed a clean cloth soaked in the brown liquid against the closed wound and held it there. One hand flat against her ribs, impersonal, clinical, and yet the warmth of his palm reached her through the cloth, and she was furious at her own body for registering it. The fire settled. Snow pushed against the shutters. One of the wolves exhaled slowly. He was still holding the cloth in place, waiting for the antiseptic to do its work, when his head tilted. Just slightly. A degree of movement so small most people would have missed it. Leslie did not miss it. She had spent 7 years watching dominant wolves for exactly that kind of microshift, the subtle recalibration of senses catching something unexpected. Her stomach went cold. She had kept it buried for so long it had become reflex, the constant low-level suppression, the careful management of her own scent frequencies, the habit of making herself olfactorily unremarkable. In the compound, it had been survival arithmetic. Gifted Omegas disappeared into council collection units. You hid what you had, or you lost it along with everything else. She had been hiding since she was 16 years old. But she was exhausted, and blood loss was apparently better at dismantling 7 years of practiced concealment than the Grey Veil betas had ever been. Trevor did not move. He finished his count, removed the cloth, smoothed a thin layer of salve across the stitches with his thumb. He folded the soiled cloth. He set it aside. The silence stretched. Leslie counted her own heartbeats and kept her face arranged into something blank and unrevealing, and waited for him to reach for the collar chain that all council enforcers carried. Waited for the calculation she'd seen in so many alpha eyes, the one where she stopped being a person and became an asset. How long have you been hiding it? His voice was the same as it had been all night, low, uninflected. The question had no edges on it, no trap she could clearly identify, which somehow made it worse. Leslie looked at the fire. She thought about Kale's claws, about the Grey Veil compound at dawn, with the mist coming off the snow, and the other Omegas moving in the careful, measured way of people who had learned not to draw attention. About 16 years old and understanding for the first time what she was, and what that meant, and choosing silence like you choose a locked door. She said nothing, but she did not deny it. Trevor nodded once, as though she had answered fully, and rose from the hearthstone to clean his hands. Chapter 3. She asked him on the second day. The blizzard had sealed the cabin entirely by morning, white-packed solid against the lower shutters, the door unmovable until Trevor put his shoulder to it and forced it open by 6 inches to check the wolves' scouting perimeter. He'd come back inside stamped with snow and said nothing, and the cabin had resumed its particular silence, which was different from the silence of the Grey Veil compound. That silence had been enforced. This one simply existed, like weather, like the cold, like the weight of the man on the other side of the fire who read from a battered field ledger and made occasional notes in margins that were already dense with older notations. Leslie's stitches held. The fever that had threatened on the first night had receded by dawn, which she credited to the salve more than to any resilience of her own. She could sit upright. She could think in straight lines again. And thinking in straight lines led, inevitably, to questions. "Why are you here?" she said. Trevor did not look up from the ledger. "I live here." "You know what I mean." He did look up then, studied her for a moment with that flat, measuring attention. Then he closed the ledger, set it on the floor beside his chair, and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Not performing willingness, just deciding in real time that the question had earned a real answer. "The Binding Right Tribunal," he said. 3 years ago, you would have still been in the compound." She knew the name. Every Omega knew the name, the way you know the name of the storm that took the roof off, not because anyone explained it, but because the adults went quiet when it came up, and quiet in the Grey Veil compound meant something significant had shifted in the architecture of power. Trevor told it without decoration. He had been Alpha King for 4 years when he brought the motion before the High Pack Council, a formal challenge to the binding rights, the ancient legal framework that classified Omegas as pack-bonded property, transferable by contract, ownable by bloodline claim. He had come with documentation, testimonies. 3 other alpha heads who had quietly agreed the system was indefensible and loudly agreed to nothing when the council chamber filled and the weight of tradition pressed down like a physical thing. The three alphas recanted before the second session. Trevor did not. He told the council, in the precise and level tone of a man who had decided the conversation was more important than its consequences, that what they were administering was not tradition. It was not law in any meaningful sense. It was a commerce system, dressed in ritual language, and the product being traded was people. The chamber had gone very still. He said the word they had spent 2 centuries legislating around. He said it plainly, without rhetorical framing, without the softening clauses that might have preserved some fraction of his position. Legal slavery. That was what he called it. In front of 32 Alpha Council seats and a full gallery of PAC representatives, they stripped him before the session ended. Not ceremonially. There was no dramatic removal of crown or clasp. His Alpha King authority was simply declared void, his territorial claims dissolved, his PAC bonds severed by council decree. He was given until dawn to clear the palace grounds. He was gone before midnight. Leslie watched him tell it. His hands stayed loose, his voice stayed even. There was no performance of stoicism. It was simply the actual absence of self-pity, which was a different thing entirely, and somehow harder to be in the presence of. Self-pity, she understood. She had felt it herself, in small, careful doses, in the dark. This was something else. This was a man who had made a calculation, accepted the result, and moved forward without requiring the universe to acknowledge the cost as unfair. "You lost everything," she said. "I lost the position," he said. "That's not the same thing." She thought about that. Outside the snow pressed, and the cabin's single candle bent in a draft from the shutters, and the larger wolf. She had started thinking of it as the left wolf from that first night, shifted in its sleep and exhaled slowly. She had been told the story of the tribunal once, in the compound, by an older Omega named Sarah, who had a habit of collecting dangerous information the way other people collected grievances. Sarah had called Trevor Ashcore a destabilizer, a man who broke things without a plan for what came after. Looking at him now, at the field ledger dense with years of careful notation, at the wolf head clasp that still sat at his belt even without a crown above it, at the man who had oiled his door hinges and mapped his territory alone for 3 years without once appearing to require rescue from the narrative of his own ruin. Leslie thought that Sarah had perhaps been working from incomplete information. She was beginning to suspect they all had. Chapter 4. The wolves came back wrong. Leslie knew it before Trevor did. Or at least she knew it at the same time, which surprised her because she had spent 7 years training herself not to read dominant wolves, not to track their moods or patterns or the particular frequency shift in the air around them, when something had changed. Attention was a 2-way mechanism. You noticed things. Things noticed you noticing. In the Gray Vale compound that had been a reliable path to trouble. But the cabin had been quiet for 2 days, and her nervous system had apparently decided, without consulting her, to start cataloging it. The way the left wolf slept, the way the right one paced to the door at intervals, precise as a clock, and then returned to the hearthrug satisfied. The rhythm of it. The normalcy. So when they came through the door on the 3rd afternoon and the rhythm was gone, both of them tight-shouldered, heads low, moving with the compressed energy of animals that had been running hard and had not resolved whatever sent them running. She was already sitting up straight before Trevor crossed the room. He crouched between them. No commands. He simply put his hands on their coats, one palm on each wolf, and went still the way a man goes still when he is reading something through his fingertips. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. She caught it. Then he lifted his right hand and looked at it. The blood was dried dark, caught in the grain of the right wolf's coat along the shoulder. Not its own blood, she could tell from the way the wolf moved freely, no favoring, no stiffness, foreign blood, someone else's, transferred from contact or proximity, or a warning delivered in the only language wolves used when words weren't an option. Trevor stood. He went to the table and unrolled the territory map he kept weighted at the corners with 4 flat stones, and he stood over it for a long moment before he picked up the charcoal and began to mark. Leslie came to stand beside him. She had looked at the map before, in idle inventory during the long, snowbound hours, the way you learned any space you might need to move through quickly. She knew the cabin's position, the ridge lines, the drainage channels that Trevor had marked in a different hand, older notations, the kind made over months, not minutes. She knew the Frostholm tree line and the 2 approach routes from the eastern pass. She watched him mark 4 positions along the northern ridge, then 2 more on the western decline, then 1, after a pause, after some internal calculation she couldn't follow, far to the south below the creek bed. 7 marks. Enforcers, she said. Council contracted, Grey Vale directed. He set the charcoal down. Cale Dross runs his trackers in a specific pattern. I've seen the reports. 3-point compression sweep. You send your outriders wide, you pull them inward slow, you make the target feel the open ground closing. He touched the southern mark. This one is the tell. Nobody sweeps that far south in a Frostholm winter unless they're not looking for something, unless they're making sure something doesn't go south. Leslie studied the marks. The geometry of them assembled itself in her mind with unpleasant clarity. Not a search pattern, a shape. The 7 positions formed a rough enclosure, wide and loose at the edges still, but the direction of the logic was unmistakable. They were not casting outward to find her. They were drawing inward to contain her. They're herding, she said, toward the eastern pass. He tapped the map. Only exit point that stays viable in deep snow. They know that. They're making sure it's the only option we appear to have. The correction was small and immediate, and he did not remark on it. Neither did she. How long? She said. 18 hours, maybe less if Dross pushes the southern unit faster than the snow allows. He rolled the map with the same unhurried efficiency he applied to everything. He'll push. Leslie moved back to the fire and stood with her arms crossed and her eyes on nothing in particular, doing the arithmetic she had been doing since the moment she understood Cale Dross was personally leading the retrieval unit. Cale did not contract out to council enforcers for standard fugitive recovery. The cost was prohibitive. The bureaucratic entanglement alone took weeks to authorize. You did not bring council enforcers into Frostholm territory for a runaway Omega. You brought them for what the Omega carried. She thought about the suture thread, the brown bottle, Trevor's palm flat against her ribs, his head tilting by 1 single degree in the firelight. He knew what she was, which meant that if Cale's trackers were reading the scent trail correctly, they would know she was here, and they would know she had been in contact with Trevor Ashcore for 3 days. They were not just hunting her anymore. They're coming for both of us, she said. Trevor set the rolled map against the wall. Yes, he said. I know. Chapter 5. He told her about the vault the same way he'd told her everything else, without preamble, without softening, as though information was a tool, and the only relevant question was whether she could use it. They were eating. Or he was eating, and she was managing. Dried meat and hard flatbread that tasted of wood smoke and salt, which was still categorically better than bark ice. The wolves were restless, moving between the door and the hearthrug in slow circuits, reading the barometric shift that meant the blizzard was finally exhausting itself. By morning, the snow would stop. That was not entirely good news. Trevor set down his food and said, "There is a facility beneath the Frostholm mountain shelf. The council calls it the Vault. It has been there for 15 years. Leslie looked at him. "It's an archive," he said. "Document storage. Climate-sealed chambers cut into the rock below the frost line where paper keeps indefinitely." He paused. "What it holds is the administrative record of the binding rights system. Every registry, every bloodline ownership transfer, every council authorization for the collection of gifted Omegas across the six-pack territories." Another pause, shorter. Collection is their word. She understood what word he was replacing. "I've spent 3 years locating it," he said. "The council doesn't advertise its existence. They don't need to. The packs that benefit from the registry system have no reason to expose it, and the Omegas who might have reason don't have access to the kind of sources that would confirm it exists." He looked at her directly. "I had those sources before the tribunal stripped them. But you found it anyway. I found it anyway." Leslie set her own food down. The fire had burned low, and the cabin had taken on the particular quality of darkness that meant the candle was the only light, and in that reduced visibility, Trevor's face was all shadow and stillness, and the flat patience of a man who had been sitting with this information alone for a very long time. "My name is in there," she said. It was not quite a question. "If Cale Dross processed your induction through official channels, yes? Greyvale Pack has been running council-registered Omega collection for at least 9 years. That's documented in the partial records I was able to pull before my archive access was cut." He held her gaze. "If your name is in the Frostholm registry, it means your induction into the Greyvale compound was not a pack internal matter. It means the council authorized it. It means they classified you, cataloged your gift, and assigned you a property designation under high law." The word landed with its full weight and she let it, because flinching from it didn't change its accuracy. "That's a violation," he continued. "The high law that the council itself drafted, before they began selectively enforcing it, prohibits the registry classification of any Omega without independent tribunal review and documented consent. They abolished that review process 11 years ago and simply continued the registrations. If those records are intact and can be authenticated, it is not a political argument, it is a legal case. 37 high law, violations minimum across 6 packs, authorized directly from the council seat." Leslie was quiet for a moment. Outside, the blizzard pushed its last effort against the shutters and then subsided, and the sudden relative quiet felt like the world holding its breath. "You've been waiting," she said slowly, "for 3 years, in this cabin. For what? Someone to go in with you?" Something moved across his face, not embarrassment, something more austere than that. "I've been waiting for cause," he said. "The vault is guarded. The approach is exposed. Going in alone to retrieve records I cannot authenticate without corroborating testimony is strategically inadequate." He looked at her steadily. "A registered Omega whose name appears in the Frostholm registry, recovered from Greyvale Pack territory in a documented escape. That is corroborating testimony. That changes the evidential weight of everything inside that archive." She understood then, not that he had been using her. The distinction was too precise for that framing. She was not a tool he had manufactured. She was a variable he had not planned for, arriving through his door bleeding on his floorboards, and he was honest enough to tell her plainly what her presence made possible rather than maneuver her toward it without her knowledge. She thought about Cale Dross tightening his net, 18 hours dissolving into 16, into 12, into the moment the eastern pass closed, and the shape on the map became a room with no door. They could run into the Frostholm wilderness, away from the compression sweep, into the kind of survival that stretched on indefinitely and changed nothing for anyone left behind in any Greyvale healing ward. Or they could move first. "Where is the entrance?" she said. Trevor reached for the map. Chapter 6. The drainage channel was not wide enough for Trevor's shoulders, and he did not pretend otherwise. He went sideways, one arm pressed flat against the stone ceiling, the other holding the shielded lamp at an angle that threw more shadow than light. Leslie followed 3 paces behind him, her shawl tucked close, her breath coming in short white plumes that dissolved before they could give anything away. The channel smelled of old iron, and standing water turned to frost, and something beneath that. Paper, dust, the particular staleness of a room that had been sealed for the specific purpose of keeping things inside it. Trevor had found this channel 2 years ago on his 3rd survey of the vault's outer structure. A collapse in the eastern drainage wall, old enough that the council's maintenance logs had stopped noting it. He had measured the gap, marked the depth on his maps, and filed it away in the part of his mind where he kept things he might someday need and hoped he never would. He had always imagined, in some vague and solitary way, that if he ever used it, he would be alone. He was not alone. The channel let out into a sub-corridor behind the archive's secondary wall. Trevor killed the lamp before they moved into the open space, and for a long moment they stood in total darkness, listening. Nothing moved. The cold here was different from the cold outside. Not brutal, but deliberate, maintained. The kind of temperature chosen to preserve rather than to punish. The council had built this place to last. Leslie touched his arm once, and he moved. The archive corridors were numbered in a system that meant something to someone who had spent years cross-referencing council territorial records from the outside. Trevor had. He moved through the dark with the quiet of a man who had rehearsed this route in his head so many times that the space had become more real to him in memory than it was now in body. Leslie kept pace without being told to, reading his movements through the dark with an instinct that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with 7 years of learning how to read what the people around her intended before they decided to act on it. The Grey Veil registry was filed under Bloodline Origin, Eastern Pac's 3rd tier. Trevor found it in under 4 minutes. He handed it to Leslie without ceremony and swept his lamp once across the adjacent section. He stopped. He swept it again. There were not 2 registries in this section. There were not 3. There were 5 separate Bloodline folders, Grey Veil among them, all filed under the same classification code, all bearing the same amendment stamps along their spines. The same date, the same authorizing seal. He pulled the nearest one and opened it, and the document inside was not a registry. It was a transfer order. Names, gift classifications, assigned pack designations, acquisition costs rendered in the clean administrative language of livestock procurement. He stood very still for a moment. Then he pulled all 5. Leslie had not moved. She was standing with the Grey Veil folder open in both hands, reading in the thin light with the focused quiet of someone who has already understood and is now simply confirming. She turned a page. She turned another. Trevor watched her face and did not speak. She was not surprised. That was the thing that landed in him with the weight of something he could not put down quickly. She was not surprised. Her expression was the expression of a woman reading a document that put precise and formal language to something she had already known in her body for 7 years. Every small cruelty accounted for, every quiet transaction named at last, everything she had been made to doubt about her own experience written out in the council's careful hand and filed alphabetically for retrieval. She closed the folder. She tucked it under her arm with the clean efficiency of someone who has made a decision and is finished deliberating. Her hands did not shake. Not once, not even at the edges. Trevor had known soldiers who shook pulling evidence of far smaller crimes, and he noted this about her the way he noted everything, with precision and without sentimentality. but something beneath his ribs registered it differently, not as data, as the specific, irreversible kind of respect that comes from watching someone refuse to collapse under the full weight of being proven right about the worst thing they ever suspected. He handed her the other 4 folders without comment. She took them. "How many more sections?" she said quietly. "None we need tonight." She nodded once and looked toward the corridor that would take them back to the drainage channel and the dark and the long, cold run ahead of them. "Then let's not waste the cold," she said. He followed her out. Chapter 7. They heard the unit before they saw it. Trevor caught it first, the particular resonance of multiple wolves mid-transition, the low harmonic that ran beneath human hearing and registered instead in the chest, in the back teeth, in the oldest animal part of the brain that still knew what that sound meant. He put his arm out. Leslie stopped. They stood at the edge of the main corridor's junction, and Trevor looked around the corner for exactly 1 second before pulling back. 6. He held up the fingers against the wall where she could see them. She looked at his hand and then looked at him, and he watched her run the same calculation he just had. 1 exit, 1 corridor, 6 alphas in various stages of shift, which meant the council had not sent this unit to negotiate or to capture. They had sent it to end the problem and collect what was left. Cale Dross stood at the center of them, not shifted. He didn't need to be. He was the kind of man who understood that staying human in a room full of half-wolves was its own statement of dominance, that the message it sent was, "I don't need what they have. You are not worth that much of me." He was looking directly at the junction as though he had known exactly where they would emerge, and his expression held the satisfied stillness of someone who has been patient for a long time and is now being rewarded for it. Trevor stepped into the corridor. It was not a tactical decision. It was what he was, the thing the exile had not ground out of him and the cold had not finished, that bedrock refusal to put another body between himself and the thing coming. He stepped out with his weight forward and his hands open at his sides, and Leslie heard the shift in his breathing that meant he was already calculating which of the 6 he would reach first, and what it would cost him. She did not move immediately. She stood at the edge of the junction with the files under her arm and watched the 6 shifted wolves and felt, as she had always felt in the presence of alphas mid-change, that frequency, that thin sub-audible hum that lived beneath the visible transformation like a current beneath ice. She had felt it since she was 12 years old and had never told a single person. She had felt it in the Greyvale compound every day for 7 years and had folded herself down around it the way you fold yourself around a wound, carefully, consistently, until the hiding became indistinguishable from the thing itself. She had used it twice, both times on a single wolf, both times in pure defense, instinctive and small, the equivalent of flinching. She had spent 7 years telling herself it was not a weapon. She had spent 7 years telling herself it was not even really hers. Trevor's shoulder dropped into a fighting stance. Leslie stepped into the corridor. She did not think about the number. She did not think about what she had never done before, or what the consequences of being seen would be, or how far the sound of this would travel through council ranks when Cale Dross reported back. If Cale Dross reported back. She looked at the 6 wolves and she found the frequency, and she did not reach for it carefully or partially, or with any of the measured self-erasure she had spent 7 years perfecting. She opened it entirely. It was not loud. That was the thing about it. There was no sound at all, no crackle, no visible light, no theatrical display of power. One moment, 6 alphas were mid-shift in a frozen corridor, and the next moment they were not. The shift simply stopped, reversed, withdrew. 6 wolves folded back into 6 men who did not know why they were suddenly cold and standing on stone floors without the thing they had reached for, like a hand closing around something that was no longer there. They dropped, not dead, not even unconscious, all of them. Some caught themselves on hands and knees, some went fully down, but none of them shifted again. The frequency inside Leslie said they would not shift again for some time, and she had learned, in the long, unglamorous education of surviving, to trust what her body told her when it told her clearly. The silence in the corridor was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Cale Dross stared at her from across the bodies of his unit with an expression that moved through several stages before arriving at something cold and calculating and afraid. Trevor was staring at her too. She did not look at either of them for long. She picked up one of the folders that had slipped from her arm when she'd opened the gift. She tucked it back with the others. She looked at Trevor. "Let's go," she said. He looked at her for one more second, something shifting behind his eyes that she didn't have a name for yet and didn't need one. And then he turned and moved toward the exit, and she walked beside him, and neither of them looked back. Chapter 8. The first mile was pure survival arithmetic. Trevor set the pace, and Leslie matched it without complaint, which told him more about the state of her than any words would have. She was not a runner, not trained for this, not built for 8 miles of broken terrain and killing cold with wet boots and cracked ribs and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from using a gift at full capacity for the first time in your life. She ran anyway. She ran like someone who understood that the alternative was not rest. Rand and Gale materialized from the tree line within the first quarter mile, falling into flanking positions without being called. Trevor had not signaled them. They had heard what they needed to hear from half a mile out, and they ran now with their heads low and their pale eyes scanning the dark behind them, covering the trail in the systematic way of animals who had spent 3 years learning this territory, down to the last frozen stream bed and the last compromised snowpack. Council reinforcements hit the vault's outer perimeter approximately 6 minutes after Trevor and Leslie cleared the drainage channel exit. He knew this not because he heard them. The wind was wrong for that, but because Gale broke stride briefly, turned his head back once, and resumed running. 6 minutes. It was better than he'd expected, and not as good as he'd hoped. He said nothing. He ran. The second and third miles took them through the lower Frostholm shelf, where the snow was thigh-deep in the drifts and the ground beneath it was treacherous, ice-covered rock, hidden drops, the kind of terrain that snapped ankles and ended flights. Trevor broke the path ahead of Leslie, and she stepped in his wake, conserving what she could. He was aware of her breathing behind him, the way he had become over these days, aware of most things about her. Not with intention, simply with the particular attention that came from sharing close quarters with someone whose survival had become a logistical concern that had gradually, without announcement, become something else. He did not examine what the something else was. Not here. Not yet. By the 4th mile, she was flagging. He could hear it in the changed rhythm of her footfalls, the fraction of a second's additional delay before each stride. He slowed without making a production of it, adjusting the pace so gradually that she would not know he had done it for her, only that somehow the run had become survivable again. She did not thank him. She did not need to. That too he noted and set aside. The 5th mile brought them to the crossing, a frozen tributary that cut across their route, and that Trevor had not entirely trusted on the way in. He tested it with his boot heel, listened, moved across fast and low, and turned back to watch Leslie do the same. She moved without hesitation. Halfway across the ice groaned, and she didn't slow, didn't look down, kept her eyes on the far bank and reached it. He turned and ran. She was beside him in 4 strides. The 6th mile was the worst. The terrain rose sharply and the cold had found the inside of his chest, in the way it sometimes did in the deep Frostholm night, the way that reminded him he was not untouchable simply because he had survived everything so far. He thought about the 5 registry folders wrapped in oilskin inside Leslie's carried bundle. He thought about the names inside them. He thought about what Cale Dross's face had looked like in the moment he understood what Leslie was, and the cold became easier to run through. Rand dropped back during the 7th mile and did not return. Trevor knew what that meant. The wolf had found a way to buy them time and had taken it and would circle back when he could. He did not slow for this either. Rand had made his own calculation, and Trevor respected it. Leslie said nothing about Rand's absence. She had seen it too. The 8th mile was quiet in the way that things are quiet after enormous noise. Not peaceful, but emptied out, the silence of a space where something large has been and gone. They ran it side by side on the wider trail that led to the far tree line, no longer needing single file, and Trevor was aware of her at his shoulder with a steadiness that had not been there a week ago, and that could not be unfelt now. They reached the tree line as the sky began its first gray suggestion of dawn. They stopped. They stood. They breathed. Leslie looked out at the white miles they had just crossed, and Trevor looked at her, and there was nothing to say that would have been equal to it, to what they had each seen the other carry, to what they had each watched the other refuse to put down. He did not try to find the words. Neither did she. Some things did not need language to become true. Chapter 9. The overhang was not comfortable and was not meant to be. It was a shelf of granite that jutted from the hillside at an angle that blocked the wind from the north and the sightlines from the valley below, and Trevor had noted it on his maps 3 years ago under the category of last resorts. The ground beneath it was frozen dirt and loose shale. They sat with their backs against the rock, and the oilskin bundle between them, and the gray dawn coming in slow and colorless across the Frostholm white. Gale had returned 20 minutes after. They made the overhang, padding in from the east with blood on his muzzle that was not his own. He had curled at the outer edge of the shelter without ceremony, his pale eyes facing outward, and had not moved since. There had been no sign of Rand. Trevor had looked at the dark tree line for a long time before he stopped looking. Leslie had not slept. He knew because he had not slept either, and there had been no change in her breathing beside him through the long, cold wait for light. She sat with her knees drawn up and the shawl pulled close and her eyes open, doing whatever she did when she went quiet. That particular quality of stillness that he had first mistaken for emptiness and had since come to understand was the opposite. She was always thinking. She had simply learned to think in a way that took up no visible space. The dawn came. The sky moved from black to gray to the pale, flat white of a Frostholm morning, with no sun to speak of, only a general lightning, as though the dark had grown tired rather than been defeated. Trevor looked at the oilskin bundle. He looked at her. "What do you want to do?" he said. She turned her head toward him with the slight delay of someone who had heard correctly and was nonetheless recalibrating. He watched her process the question, not the tactical implications of it, not the strategic framework she would need to construct an answer, but the question itself, stripped of all of that. What do you want? He saw the moment she understood that was exactly what he meant, and nothing more. She looked away. She looked at the bundle. He waited. "No one has asked me that," she said. "In a very long time." He said nothing. The wind moved across the overhang's edge, and the cold came with it, and he let the silence sit without filling it, because he had learned, in the particular education of the last several days, that Leslie said more in the spaces after things than most people managed in the things themselves. She reached out and pulled the oilskin bundle onto her knees. She did not untie it. She rested her hands flat on top of it and looked at it the way she had looked at the gray veil registry in the vaults, with the focused, unflinching attention of someone who refuses the comfort of looking away. There are names in here, she said. Omegas, branded and filed and traded between packs like grain inventory. A pause. Some of them I know, from the compound. Girls who came through Grey Vale when I was already there, who I thought had been released when the pack stopped mentioning them. Another pause, shorter. They were not released. Trevor said nothing. I spent 7 years making myself small enough to survive, she said. Small enough to be overlooked, useful enough to be kept, careful enough to never give them a reason to look at what I carried. She lifted her eyes from the bundle and looked out at the white Frostholm morning. It worked, I survived, and every single day that it worked, someone else did not. She turned to look at him then, and her blue-gray eyes were clear and entirely without performance. No fear in them, no apology. I am not running anymore, she said. The words were quiet. They carried the weight of something that had been decided before it was spoken, in the corridor of the vault perhaps, or in the 8th mile of frozen dark, or possibly 7 years ago in a moment she had never been permitted to act on until now. Trevor received them the way they were offered, as fact, as foundation, as the first stone of something being built, rather than the last gasp of something ending. He nodded once. Then we don't run, he said. What followed was not a grand declaration. It was practical, unhurried, and conducted in low voices as the Frostholm morning settled around them. 2 people distributing the weight of a very large and dangerous thing between them, with the efficiency of people who have already decided the thing will be carried. The files would need a destination. The destination would need allies. The allies would need proof, and the proof was here, oilskin wrapped on Leslie's knees. The council had spent 15 years building a system that relied on Omegas believing they had no power and exiled kings believing they had no reach. They had been wrong on both counts. The packs would hear about it soon enough. They never went back to the cabin. Trevor did not mourn this. The cabin had been a waiting place, a structure built for endurance rather than living, for the long, lightless work of surviving an exile that was never meant to be permanent. He had kept himself there the way you keep a fire banked, low, contained, ready. He did not need it anymore. Leslie sent word to the Grey Vale compound through a channel Trevor had spent 3 years cultivating and never used. The message was 4 words. I have the files. Within 6 days, 2 Omegas from the compound's healing ward had slipped their handlers and walked north into the Frostholm tree line, following directions left in a location only someone who had lived inside those walls would know to look. They were the first. They were not the last. The High Pack Council convened an emergency session 11 days after the vault breach. The records show they voted unanimously to classify the Frostholm incident as a territorial dispute and seal all related documentation. What the records do not show is that 3 council members resigned by the following morning, or that the binding registry system quietly suspended new brandings pending internal review, or that Cale Dross filed no official report at all, because there was no version of it that did not include what Leslie had done to 6 shifted alphas in a frozen corridor without raising her voice or her hands. Trevor Ashcore was still officially dead. Leslie was still officially property of the Grey Vale bloodline. They were, between them, the most dangerous thing the council had ever dismissed. The dismantling had begun, not with armies or proclamations, but with names on oilskin pages, and a woman who had decided to stop being small, and a king who had been waiting 3 years for someone worth fighting beside. Now here's a question for you. Do you think Leslie should forgive her pack, or burn the whole system down? Drop your answer in the comments below. If this story gripped you, hit that like button and subscribe. The next chapter of this world is coming, and you do not want to miss what happens when the council finally understands what they're dealing with.